So, Season of the South is off to a good start so far, but I'm still dreading that later on in the season it is going to die off very slowly. But we're not going to be talking about that. I want to talk about the dungeon that came out recently, and I know I'm very late to the party, so please excuse me with that. I just have a lot on my plate at the minute. But I'm not going to waste any time giving you a sub story. I'm just going to get straight into the dungeon and what I think about it. And yes, I'm going to be talking over the encounters as we go through, so you've been fairly warned about spoilers. Just, if you want to actually experience the dungeon blind yourself, go and play it and then come back to the video. Trust me, it's not going anywhere. So, we're going to start off with the very first encounter, or the entrance, we'll say. It's not actually an encounter, and that is where you learn the mechanics. And speaking of mechanics, I actually quite like the mechanics of this dungeon. The idea of actually lighting up nodes and following wires around, it does add a bit of a puzzle element to everything, as opposed to just do this and do that. But the gist of the entrance is that you're learning this new mechanic, and you are going to basically find out how it all works. So to start with, you actually have to kill the Minotaurs, and they will drop a little Vex circle, I think was the best way to describe it. And it will give you a buff called Arctrician. And once you have Arctrician active, you can actually activate the nodes, but this is where it starts to become more of a mechanic rather than just shoot everything you see. For each of the nodes, they actually have a starting node, and the way you can identify these starting nodes is they look a little bit different to the regular nodes, and they've got arrows pointing into the center. So you shoot one of these to start the circuit off, and then you follow the wires around, shooting the nodes in concurrent with each other. And as you can probably imagine, yes, shooting the wrong node or missing a node, it won't actually activate it. The way you can tell if it's activated properly or not is if the wire goes blue from the previous node to the one you've just shot. But basically, you follow the entire node round until you get from start to finish. When you actually hit the end node, they kind of close up, and that is pretty much that sequence done. On the entrance, you have to do 4 nodes, but when you've done that, the doors open, and you get to go down into the bunker and towards the Spire itself, which is where you come onto your first jumping puzzle. And I quite like this jumping area, because it's not exactly as clear-cut as the previous jumping puzzles have been. You actually have to look around and think about where your next area is going to be, rather than just pretty much follow it in a very obvious and linear path. Like, jumping across the bridges is fairly straightforward, but when you get to the platforms that are in the center bit, which you can see on screen now, these have a little bit more thinking behind it, because I remember thinking for a good 10 minutes, like, where I would need to go after the end platform, and it's really hard to see when you first look at it, but there's like a little ledge that points out. When you jump down to there, everything becomes a bit more clear cut. And then obviously there's that little bit at the end where you have to do a blind jump around the pillar, and that is how you progress into the actual lift. But after the jumping puzzle is done, we move on to my favourite encounter of the bunch. So that is scaling up the tower. And to scale up said tower, you have to do exactly what you did at the entrance. You have to activate all the nodes and get the 2 circuits working, which will activate a grav lift or elevator, whatever you want to call them. Obviously, if you're running this as a duo or a full fire team, this encounter is very easy. That's why I would highly recommend you give it a go on solo, because I personally find it very thrilling to do. And not only that, I do like the encounter as a whole, because you're scaling a tower. You're not actually like going down into a deep dingy cave somewhere or some kind of underground area. You get to scale a tower, and if you fall off, you're pretty much dead. It just adds another level of danger to the whole thing, I think, and I quite enjoy that about this dungeon. But after you've done all 6 chains of the nodes, you will get your first chest of the dungeon. But we now reach our first boss encounter, and let me just say one thing, Bungie needs to be doing a lot better when it comes to making bosses for these dungeons, because the idea is we're paying extra money for a dungeon pass, so I'm expecting brand new content every single time. And basically what they've given us is the raid boss from Garden of Salvation, which, I'm not gonna lie, I do like the raid boss. But as a raid boss, it doesn't really fit the aesthetic of a dungeon boss. Like, the encounter works because you've picked that boss and then built it around that, so I kind of get, like, how it fits. But honestly, there should have been something completely new there, I don't care what. But having the DPS phase literally the exact same as the raid encounter is very lazy from Bungie. Never mind just having the same boss, but copying the same DPS phase? No, they definitely need to be doing better if we're paying extra money. But I'm just going to move on, because honestly, I don't feel like talking about this boss anymore, and I'm going to be just complaining about it if I do. When the boss is beaten, you go down into the Spire, and I'm going to be honest, this is where the dungeon starts to fall off a bit for me. I think it's because as you dive down into the tower itself, the aesthetic starts to get lost on me a bit, and it's not so much as a wonder. And I know these are basically 3 teaching rooms for the new nodes that you've got to take into consideration for the final boss, but it just feels a bit lackluster to me. But as you delve down all the way, you get to the final boss, which is a giant chicken. And I don't like the chickens in this game, as a rule of thumb, so yeah, I really didn't like this boss. And it's not because the boss itself is bad, like, this boss has more of a purpose of being there than the one that on top of the Spire had being there. Like, at least the reason that this wyvern is there is that it's trying to take out the core of the spire, whereas the harpy thing in the top, no, that wasn't really doing anything up there. And not only that, I don't think we've ever had a wyvern as a raid or a dungeon boss. Like, it's not as far as I can remember. But the way they've mixed the mechanics up in this final boss room is quite cool, in my opinion, because you need to be aware of both mechanics at all times. And albeit it is very straightforward to actually do when you start getting it down, the chains that go through into the other room still confuse me from time to time. And then not to mention, the actual crit spot on the wyvern is unbelievably small. So not only is the crit spot really hard to hit and try to narrow down when it comes to damage, he also has an absurd amount of health. So in the clips you're seeing now, I actually had to do 5 damage phases, and I actually did 5 million points of damage as well. And I'm not being funny, if I have to do pretty much 7 million, if not 8 million points of damage to defeat a boss, and this is a dungeon boss, not a raid boss, then you're taking the piss. Because at least when we were fighting Caretaker in a raid, it actually made sense for him to have 20 million HP. Even though, oh my god, it took the piss to kill him. I think I just genuinely want Bungie to make more technically challenging dungeons, as opposed to just making bosses absolute bullet sponges. Like, the mechanics in this encounter are good. And I don't know, for heaven's sake, you could have put like a random rare enemy that spawns every now and again, and if you don't kill it quick enough, it detonates the core or something like that. Like, that would be an active challenge to keep an eye out for, rather than just having the boss being a massive bullet sponge. But overall, I'm actually quite happy with this dungeon. Like, if you compare it to Duality, when we had that on launch, Spire of the Watcher is already significantly better, because you don't have a game-breaking glitch straight off the bat this time. Albeit, I did like the Duality better when it comes to actually exploring. I did feel like there was a lot more mystique in that dungeon. But like I said, I'm just a fan of being able to scale a massive tower, as opposed to going into some deep and dingy cave. But that is my opinions on this dungeon. Please let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. And obviously, if you like the video, leave a like as well. But for now, I shall see you all in the next video.